In the autumn of 1945, in the ruins of a Japanese city that had just survived the deadliest war in human history, a man named Soichiro Honda was sitting in the rubble of his factory with nothing. The building had been destroyed, not once, twice, first by American bombing raids that flattened most of Hamamatsu, then by a massive earthquake that finished off what the bombs had left standing. His equipment was gone. His workforce had scattered. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and the country was attempting to process the scale of what had just happened. The cities reduced to ash, the economy in complete collapse, 16 years of military expansion ending in total defeat. Soichiro Honda was 38 years old. He had no factory, no product, no capital, and no clear plan. 15 years later, Honda Motor Company was the largest motorcycle manufacturer on the planet. 20 years after that, Honda automobiles were being driven on every continent. Today, Honda is one of the 10 largest automobile manufacturers in the world, employs over 200,000 people, and generates revenues exceeding $130 billion per year. One man, starting from rubble, with no formal engineering degree, no family money, no government connections, and no obvious reason to believe any of it was possible. But here's the thing nobody tells you about Soichiro Honda. The rubble wasn't the hard part. The hard part came much earlier, in a blacksmith's workshop in a tiny Japanese village in 1914, where a young boy was watching a machine move for the very first time and feeling something shift inside him that would never shift back. This is the story of how a school dropout from rural Japan built one of the most consequential companies in the history of manufacturing. And it starts not in a boardroom, not in a laboratory, but in the mud of a village road where a gasoline engine first made a sound that a 9-year-old boy could not stop thinking about. Tokyo, 1922. Soichiro Honda arrived at Art Shokai as a 15-year-old boy from a farming village with no formal technical training and no particular reason to expect that anyone would take him seriously. The owner did not immediately assign him to engine work. He assigned him to look after his infant child. This was standard practice for new apprentices in Japan. You began at the bottom and worked upward through demonstrated reliability before you were trusted with anything technically significant. Most young men found this humiliating. Honda accepted it without complaint and spent his time watching every repair operation in the workshop with the focused attention of someone who understood that observation was its own form of education. When mechanics were not looking, he touched the parts they had set aside. He memorized sequences of disassembly and reassembly by watching them performed once, twice, a third time. Within a year, he was performing repairs independently. Within 2 years, he was the most technically capable person in the workshop for certain categories of engine problem, not because he had been formally taught, but because he had a gift for mechanical reasoning that formal teaching had never managed to either develop or suppress. What set Soichiro apart was a specific kind of problem-solving orientation, an absolute refusal to accept that a mechanical problem was unsolvable. Other mechanics, when they encountered a problem they couldn't immediately diagnose, would set it aside and move to the next job. Soichiro would stay with it. He would disassemble further. He would think about what the machine was trying to do and work backward from the failure to its cause. In 1928, after 6 years at Art Shokai, he opened his own branch in Hamamatsu. The shop was an immediate success. But Honda was not satisfied with being a repair shop owner. A repair shop is reactive. It fixes what is broken. It does not create. And Soichiro Honda had always wanted to create. In 1936, he entered a car race in Tokyo, driving a machine he had designed and built himself. The car overturned. He sustained serious injuries, a broken wrist, a fractured face, and spent months hospitalized. The racing community told him the accident was a warning. Honda resumed racing as soon as he was physically able. He did not regard the accident as a warning, he regarded it as data. Something in the car's design had failed. He needed to understand what, and fix it. Failure was not the opposite of success. Failure was the process through which success was eventually reached. He would need that posture more than he could have imagined, because the war was coming. In 1937, Japan went to war with China. In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. By 1944, American bombing campaigns were systematically destroying Japan's industrial cities. Hamamatsu, as a manufacturing center, was a priority target. Soichiro Honda had by this point sold his repair business and established the Tokai Seiki Heavy Industry Company, which produced piston rings for Toyota and other major manufacturers. The path had not been smooth. Honda's early piston ring designs failed Toyota's quality inspections repeatedly. The metallurgy was wrong, the dimensions inconsistent. A lesser man would have returned to the repair business he already knew how to run successfully. Honda enrolled in the Hamamatsu School of Technology to study metallurgy, not as a degree student, but as an auditor, attending only the classes relevant to his specific problem. He was not interested in the credential. He was interested in the knowledge. He solved the metallurgy problem. Toyota began accepting his rings. The business grew. Then the bombs began falling. In December 1944, American B-29 bombers struck Hamamatsu. Honda's factory was hit. Equipment wrecked. Buildings collapsed. Years of accumulated work reduced to twisted metal in a single night. Honda assessed the damage and began rebuilding. In January 1945, a second wave of bombing destroyed what little had survived. Then, a major earthquake finished off the rest. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Soichiro Honda was 38 years old, sitting in the ruins of his factory with no workforce, no equipment, and no plan. He sold the remains of Tokai Seiki to Toyota for a modest sum. Then he spent several months doing something he had rarely allowed himself, thinking, not working, not building, just thinking. What came next was motorcycles. Not from a market analysis, but because he had military surplus engines sitting in his possession. Tiny two-stroke motors designed to power radio equipment, now useless for their original purpose. Honda attached one to a bicycle frame, added a fuel tank improvised from a water bottle, ran a belt from the engine to the rear wheel. The machine was crude, but it moved under its own power. He showed it to his neighbors. They wanted one. He made them one each. Their neighbors wanted one. Honda made more. In October 1946, he established the Honda Technical Research Institute in a small shed in Hamamatsu. 12 people, 200 square feet, no formal engineering degree, no savings, no certainty it would survive its first year. Within 30 years, it would be one of the largest manufacturing companies on Earth. But in October 1946, it was 12 people in a shed. The Honda Technical Research Institute's first original motorcycle, the Model A, was introduced in 1947. It was not a sophisticated machine by any measure that a modern motorcyclist would recognize. The engine was a modified version of the surplus military motors Honda had been working with since 1945, a 50cc two-stroke unit producing roughly 1 horsepower attached to a standard bicycle frame through a belt drive. It sold. It sold because post-war Japan was a country in which personal transportation had become both desperately necessary and almost completely unavailable. The railways were overwhelmed. Automobiles were beyond the financial reach of virtually any ordinary Japanese citizen. Bicycles were available, but for the distances that people needed to travel as they attempted to reconstruct their economic lives in the ruins of the war, bicycles were slow and exhausting. A motorized bicycle that cost a fraction of an automobile and required minimal mechanical knowledge to operate was not just a product, it was a solution to a problem that millions of people were experiencing every day. Honda understood this not because he had conducted market research, but because he was living in the same Japan that everyone else was living in. He saw the problem with his own eyes. He built the solution with his own hands. The Model A was followed rapidly by the Model B, then the Model C, then the Model D, each iteration improving on its predecessor in engine power, reliability, and overall design quality. Honda was learning through production, fixing problems as they emerged, incorporating lessons from each generation of product into the next. The pace of improvement was striking. Within 2 years of the first Model A, Honda's motorcycles were mechanically superior to the improvised first generation in almost every measurable way. But growth required capital, and capital required a partner. In 1949, Soichiro Honda met Takeo Fujisawa. Fujisawa was a businessman, not an engineer, not a mechanic, not a technical person in any way. He was a salesman and a financial strategist, a man who understood markets and money and organizational structure in ways that Honda, for all his mechanical genius, did not. The two men could not have been more different in their skills, their temperaments, or their approaches to problems. They became one of the most effective business partnerships in the history of Japanese industry. The arrangement was explicit and deliberate. Honda would control everything technical: product design, engineering, manufacturing, the decisions about what to build and how to build it. Fujisawa would control everything commercial: sales, distribution, finance, the decisions about how to sell what Honda built, and how to fund the operations that made it possible. Neither man would interfere in the other's domain. This clarity of responsibility, unusual in Japanese business culture of the era, which tended toward consensus and collective decision-making, gave Honda Motor Company a speed and decisiveness that its competitors could not match. In 1949, Honda introduced the Dream D-Type, the company's first purpose-built motorcycle, designed from the ground up rather than adapted from existing bicycle frames and surplus motors. The Dream had a 98cc two-stroke engine, a proper suspension system, and a level of engineering refinement that represented a significant leap over anything Honda had previously produced. It was named with characteristic directness for what Soichiro Honda had been chasing his entire adult life. The Dream sold well, but Fujisawa, surveying the Japanese market and the competitive landscape, identified an opportunity that Honda's technical focus had caused him to overlook: the rural market. The farmers, the small business owners, the people who lived in the countryside and needed affordable transportation for short distances over poor roads, was largely unserved by existing motorcycles, which were designed primarily for urban use and priced accordingly. What the rural market needed was something smaller, simpler, cheaper, and more reliable over rough terrain. Fujisawa conveyed this market intelligence to Honda. Honda went back to his engineering team. The result, introduced in 1958, was the Super Cub. The Super Cub was a 50cc step-through motorcycle, meaning the rider stepped through an open frame to mount it, rather than swinging a leg over a traditional motorcycle frame. This design made it accessible to riders who had never operated a motorcycle before, including women, older riders, and anyone uncomfortable with the physical demands of mounting a conventional machine. The engine was four-stroke, meaning it was cleaner, quieter, and more fuel-efficient than the two-stroke engines that dominated the small motorcycle market. The automatic centrifugal clutch meant the rider did not need to operate a manual clutch, a significant reduction in the learning curve for new riders. The Super Cub was also critically extremely reliable. Honda's engineering team had focused obsessively on durability, on designing a machine that could be operated by someone with no mechanical knowledge, over poor roads, in difficult weather, without regular professional maintenance, and still function correctly for years. This was not the normal engineering priority in the motorcycle industry of the late 1950s, which tended to produce machines that rewarded mechanically knowledgeable owners and punished those who could not maintain them. Honda was designing for a different kind of customer. He was designing for everyone. The Super Cub launched in Japan in 1958. By 1960, Honda was producing over 100,000 units per month. It was the fastest-selling motorcycle in Japanese history. By 1963, Honda was selling Super Cubs in the United States, the world's largest motorcycle market, through a marketing campaign that deliberately targeted non-motorcyclists with the tagline, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda," which positioned the Super Cub as a friendly, accessible, everyday vehicle rather than the dangerous, outlaw-associated machine that American popular culture had made motorcycles into during the 1950s. The American campaign was a commercial revolution. Honda did not simply enter the US motorcycle market. It expanded the market, creating millions of new motorcycle customers who had never considered owning one before. By 1965, Honda had captured 63% of the American motorcycle market. Every major American and European motorcycle manufacturer was scrambling to understand what had hit them. The Super Cub is now the best-selling motor vehicle in human history. Over 100 million units have been produced since 1958. It is still in production today. More Super Cubs have been built than any car, any truck, any other motorcycle, any motorized vehicle of any kind ever made. But Soichiro Honda was not finished, because motorcycles, for all their success, were not where he had been pointing since 1914. He had always been pointing at cars. In 1963, Honda Motor Company announced that it was entering the automobile market. The reaction from the Japanese government was immediate and hostile. Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, was the powerful government body that effectively directed the development of Japanese industry in the post-war period. MIT had a plan for the Japanese automobile industry. It would be dominated by Toyota and Nissan, which had the scale, the capital, and the organizational infrastructure to compete internationally. Smaller players would be consolidated, rationalized, or redirected into supporting roles. The ministry had no intention of allowing a motorcycle manufacturer to complicate this strategy by entering automobile production with no experience, insufficient capital, and no obvious competitive advantage. MIT told Honda, through official and unofficial channels, that automobile production was not appropriate for his company. The message was clear. In the hierarchical, government-directed industrial culture of 1960s Japan, this was not a suggestion. It was an instruction. Soichiro Honda ignored it completely. He had not chased a motorcar through a village road at age 9, spent 6 years apprenticing in Tokyo, survived the destruction of 2 factories, rebuilt from rubble with 12 people in a shed, and created the best-selling motor vehicle in history in order to accept a government ministry's assessment of what was appropriate for him. Honda Motor Company entered automobile production. Its first car, the T360 mini truck, and S500 sports car were introduced in 1963. They were not Toyota, they were not Nissan. They were something different, lighter, more driver-focused, engineered with the same obsessive attention to mechanical excellence that had characterized Honda's motorcycles. The S500 sports car, in particular, was remarkable for its time. It used a motorcycle-derived engine with a roller-bearing crankshaft, a design choice that allowed the engine to rev far higher than conventional automobile engines, producing a driving experience that was unlike anything in the Japanese market. It was not the most practical car, it was not the most comfortable car, but it was, in the opinion of everyone who drove it, one of the most mechanically satisfying cars that any Japanese manufacturer had yet produced. The automobiles were promising but modest in scale compared to what Honda had already achieved with motorcycles. The breakthrough that would establish Honda as a genuine force in the global automobile industry came not from a production car, but from a racing engine, and from a decision that Soichiro Honda made in 1962 that the entire global automotive establishment considered at the time completely delusional. Honda announced that his company would enter Formula One motor racing. Formula One in the early 1960s was dominated by British constructors, Lotus, BRM, Cooper, and by Ferrari, which had been racing at the highest levels of European motorsport for decades. These were organizations with engineering departments, racing traditions, sponsorship relationships, and accumulated institutional knowledge stretching back years. Honda had been making cars for less than a year. Honda had no racing department, no Formula One engineers, no experience with the specific engineering challenges of a Grand Prix car, and no reason, apart from Soichiro Honda's absolute conviction in his own engineers' ability to figure things out, to believe they could compete. Honda competed. The company's first Formula One car, the RA271, was introduced in the 1964 season. It was underdeveloped and uncompetitive. Honda's engineers were learning in real time, against teams that had spent decades accumulating the knowledge they were trying to acquire in a single racing season. In the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix, Honda won its first Formula One race. The winning driver was Richie Ginther. The winning margin was decisive. The engine, a 1.5-liter V12 that Honda's engineers had developed in less than 3 years from a standing start, produced more power than any comparable unit in the field. The racing program was not primarily about trophies. It was about engineering knowledge, the specific problems that Formula One racing forces engineers to solve, how to extract maximum power from minimum displacement, how to manage heat in extreme conditions, how to build components that are both light and strong enough to survive sustained high-stress operation, are the same problems at a more extreme level that matter in production engines. Honda's engineers were acquiring, at racing speed, knowledge that their competitors were taking decades to develop through conventional research programs. This philosophy, using extreme competition as an accelerated engineering education, would recur throughout Honda's corporate history. The company entered the Isle of Man TT motorcycle race in 1959, when its motorcycles were not yet competitive internationally, specifically to expose its engineers to the highest level of technical competition in their field. Honda won the TT in 1961. The engineering lessons learned in racing were directly applied to production motorcycles, improving their reliability and performance in ways that showed immediately in the market. The same pattern repeated in automobiles. Racing forced the engineers to be better, Better engineers made better production cars. Better production cars sold more. The revenue funded more racing. The cycle continued. By 1972, Honda had introduced the Civic, a small, practical, fuel-efficient automobile aimed at the everyday driver rather than the enthusiast. The Civic was engineered around Honda's CVCC engine technology, which used a stratified charge combustion process to meet the increasingly stringent American emission standards of the early 1970s, without requiring a catalytic converter. This matters enormously in context. The 1970 Clean Air Act in the United States had mandated dramatic reductions in automotive emissions by 1975, standards so stringent that the major American automobile manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, publicly stated they were technically impossible to meet within the legislated timeframe. They lobbied Congress for extensions. They argued that the technology did not exist to meet the standards. Honda engineers, working from a different starting point, and without the institutional inertia of organizations that had been building engines the same way for decades, developed the CVCC technology that met the 1975 standards 2 years early. In 1972, Honda demonstrated a Civic equipped with the CVCC engine to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The engine met the 1975 standards without modification. The reaction from the American automotive industry ranged from disbelief to fury. General Motors, which had told Congress the standards were impossible, quietly licensed Honda's CVCC technology the following year. The 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC's oil embargo quadrupled fuel prices overnight and created gasoline shortages across the United States and Europe, transformed the Civic from a promising product into an essential one. American consumers who had spent the previous decades buying large, fuel-hungry American automobiles discovered, with considerable urgency, that fuel efficiency mattered. Honda's small, efficient, reliable cars were exactly what a suddenly fuel-conscious market wanted. Honda sales in the United States grew rapidly through the mid-1970s. The Accord, introduced in 1976 as a slightly larger and more refined companion to the Civic, became one of the best-selling cars in American market history, occupying the top position in U.S. sales rankings for several years during the 1980s and 1990s. Soichiro Honda retired from day-to-day management of Honda Motor Company in 1973 at the age of 66. He remained active as a director and as a senior technical advisor, but the operational leadership passed to a new generation of executives he had trained. He spent his retirement years pursuing his personal interests in aviation. He learned to fly in his 60s, and in the kind of hands-on engineering tinkering that had defined his entire life. He died on August 5, 1991. He was 84 years old. At the time of his death, Honda Motor Company employed over 90,000 people, operated manufacturing facilities on 4 continents, and sold vehicles in nearly every country on Earth. The company he had founded with 12 people in a 200-square-foot shed in 1946 was generating revenues of over $30 billion annually. The Super Cub he had designed in 1958 still is. So we've seen how a boy who ran after a motor car through a village road in 1914 built one of the most consequential manufacturing companies in history. The school dropout, the failed student, the young man whose teachers saw limited promise and whose government told him explicitly to stay in his lane. The man who started from rubble twice and treated each catastrophic setback not as a reason to stop, but as information about what to do differently next time. What Soichiro Honda built was not just a company. He built a philosophy of manufacturing, the idea that the people closest to the actual work of making things, the engineers on the floor rather than the executives in the offices, should have authority over the decisions that matter most. He built a culture of obsessive quality, the conviction that a product should do exactly what it was supposed to do, reliably for everyone who used it, not just for the expert who knew how to coax performance out of it. And he built a competitive ethic, the belief that entering the hardest possible competitions against the best possible opponents was not recklessness, but the fastest available path to genuine excellence. The modern relevance is not abstract. Honda Motor Company today produces automobiles, motorcycles, marine engines, aircraft engines, power equipment, and robotics. It is one of the largest manufacturers of internal combustion engines on the planet. It is also, in the current moment, investing heavily in hydrogen fuel cell technology and electric vehicle development, trying, as it has always tried, to be ahead of where the market is going rather than simply responding to where it has been. The balanced truth about Soichiro Honda is that he was not a saint. He was, by multiple accounts, a difficult man to work for, demanding, impatient with what he perceived as insufficient effort or insufficient creativity, capable of explosive anger when he felt his engineers were not pushing hard enough against the limits of what was possible. Several of his closest early collaborators left the company over conflicts with him. His personal life was complicated in ways that the official Honda corporate history tends to minimize. But the results speak in a language that doesn't require translation. 100 million Super Cubs, the CVCC engine that the American automotive industry said was impossible. Formula One victories, the Civic and the Accord, a company that started in a shed and became a global institution, built not on inherited wealth, not on government favor, not on lucky timing, but on the specific and irreplaceable combination of mechanical obsession, competitive ferocity, and the absolute refusal to accept that failure was anything other than the next step toward getting it right. Soichiro Honda ran after that car in 1914 until it disappeared around the bend and left him standing in the road in the dust and exhaust. He spent the rest of his life building what he had chased. The question his story leaves is simple and uncomfortable. What are you running after? And are you willing to run far enough? If this one stayed with you, if there was a moment in Soichiro Honda's story that made you think about your own work differently, drop a in the comments. I want to know who made it all the way through. Honda's story is one I've wanted to cover for a long time, and getting the details right, particularly the early years in Hamamatsu, the MITI confrontation, and the real story behind the CVCC engine, required going back to primary sources rather than the simplified version that most business profiles tell. If you found that depth useful, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next one. For the natural follow-up, our video on Kiichiro Toyoda, the founder of Toyota who was building his automobile empire in the same post-war Japan that Honda was starting from rubble, tells a parallel story with very different methods and very different lessons. The contrast between how Toyota and Honda approached the same opportunity is one of the most instructive case studies in manufacturing history. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching Something Real. See you in the next one.